Father McGivney started the Knights of Columbus, as we all know, in the basement of St. Mary's Church in New Haven. And they've really never left that area since because the Supreme Headquarters is in New Haven.
So this was it?
This was somewhere down here is where that first group of men gathered to found the Knights.
After years away from where he had grown up, years filled with hard work, study, and vital seminary formation, a new chapter was beginning in the life of Father Michael McGivney, one that would bring him much closer to home. He was ordained on December 22nd, 1877, and without delay began his work as a parish priest. Assigned by Bishop Thomas Galberry to minister to the people of New Haven, Connecticut, Father McGivney got to work, serving those people inside St. Mary Church and those outside the church walls too.
I think he was very excited to come to New Haven, to be back in Connecticut, to be back in the same general area where he grew up, and to be sent to this parish, which was the first Catholic church in all of New Haven, and the second Catholic church in the Archdiocese, was something he was very excited about. And after a long process of seminary, getting to his ordination finally, to finally be able to really get his feet wet and really do ministry among the people of God was something that his heart deeply desired. St. Mary Church, Father McGivney came here as a young priest, and he was a parochial vicar under Father Murphy, who was the pastor at the time. And Father McGivney became very well known for his ministry here in New Haven to his parishioners and to the city. Also, of course, very well known because while he was here as a parochial vicar, he founded the Knights of Columbus.
It was a major effort founding the Knights of Columbus, and one that came out of the intense difficulties Father McGivney saw all around him, difficulties he witnessed in the situation of so many throughout New Haven, and difficulties really that he had known and lived even growing up as a poor boy working in the mills of Waterbury.
Emerging from that environment, he was very familiar and intimately familiar with the challenges that so many of these families faced. And that gave him a deep sensitivity to their predicament and a real pastoral love to try to do everything he possibly could to help them. And again, it wasn't only the sacramental ministry that any priest would do, but he went out of his way to visit these families. If a member was sick or was ill, he would go meet them in their home, minister in their home. Obviously, often the men especially died very young back then, and that posed a whole additional set of challenges when there was a widow and children now without a father.
Looking around and seeing the great challenges of the poor, the sick, the widows, the orphans, and so many others, Father McGivney could easily have become embittered and crestfallen. And this is all the more true when you consider the severe prejudice being faced by American Catholics at that time. But this young priest didn't allow himself to be resentful and didn't give in to such intolerance. Instead, he faced the antagonism by reaching out even to those who had never accepted him or the Catholics of his flock.
The original location of the church, of the parish, was at a different location. It was a very small wooden church near the present Yale New Haven Hospital. That church burned to the ground, and it took some time, but eventually this piece of property on Hill House Avenue was purchased to build a new church. Now, presently, Hill House Avenue is all Yale. Every other building on this entire street is owned by Yale. But back in Father McGivney's day, these were all private mansions and private homes. This is where some of the wealthiest people in all of New Haven lived. And they were not Catholic. And on top of that, they had a dislike of Catholics. And so when this church was built, there was a famous article in the New York Times referring to it, among other things, as the monstrosity on Hill House Avenue, that the neighbors were all upset that now all of these poor people, undesirables, if you want to use that phrase, were going to be coming into their idyllic neighborhood and ruining the neighborhood and ruining the street. And there's no way those poor Irish were going to be able to pay for that church anyway, so certainly in a matter of a few years it was going to close. And so there was a lot of tension in the immediate neighborhood about the arrival of the Catholics here to the present St. Mary Church on Hill House.
You know, it's been said, and there's in large part true, that it's still the one acceptable prejudice that you can have in the United States is against Catholics. I don't want to overstate that, but we all know that that can be the case. But back in his day, it was absolutely the case. And I know that through a certain pastoral approach and everything, he was able to deal with some difficult ecumenical situations.
To minister, to be a priest in New Haven at the time Father McGivney was a very challenging thing. Beyond all of the normal sacramental duties and so forth a priest had, there were these much larger issues of poverty and tension that Father McGivney had to navigate.
Reverend Harwood was one of the, prominent Protestant ministers for many years in New Haven, but when they had a family crisis and their daughter had decided to convert to Catholicism, they disapproved. She then got very ill and was very close to death, calling for a priest, and the family didn't know what to do. And they were, not known to be friendly to the Roman Catholic community in New Haven, but they heard that Father McGivney could help them. And there's something to me so touching about the fact that Father McGivney was the man that Reverend Harwood called when his own family was in crisis, when he needed help. And Father McGivney counseled the whole family, counseled the daughter who did pass away. He gave her her last rites. He saw the family through this whole thing, and he felt very strongly about aspects of the church about which he had to be stubborn. There's no question he wasn't, wishy-washy about anything like that. But there was something about the word family that I'm not sure he could resist very easily. And so when this family called him, of course, their daughter in particular needed him, but I love that the whole family needed him.
This kind of effort was astounding, facing hatred with love, rejection with acceptance. But in the mind of Father McGivney, it was simply his job as a parish priest. Having personally lived and known a life of hard work and struggle, the life of real people, he didn't care to simply sit in his rectory and come out only to celebrate Mass on Sunday. He wanted to be with his people, helping his people in real and meaningful ways.
In the generation of priests before Father McGivney, the priesthood was rather cloistered. You just did not see priests mixing in general society very much at all. They kept to the church properties by and large, or to their own ministry, with families. They didn't. They led a quiet life, and I think that's partly because of the attitude toward priests in particular, but toward Catholics. I think they pulled it in.
Well, I think there's one danger for us in holy orders that we, now I'm speaking about myself here because I entered the seminary in high school in the 9th grade. So I'm somebody who didn't have this experience. But I do think that for our priests today, the fact that many of them have had some other experience in the world, quote unquote, if that's the right way to put it, before entering the seminary is actually something very good. Because I do think it gives them a sense of what ordinary people, how they're living and what they have to face. And I think that is a very healthy and good thing. Certainly it was part of Father McGivney's life, and I dare say that it was true of many people back then.
And so one of the ways that he's really fun and accessible is all the activities that he was you know, right up to his waist in. You know, he directed a big play in downtown New Haven, not because he wanted to be a director, but because the members of his, one of his early organizations, the Total Abstinence and Literary Society, wanted to put on plays. Did he have theatrical experience? No, but next thing you know, he's putting on a play. There's thousands of people in the audience, you know, sets from New York City, costumes. He picture any backstage musical in Hollywood, and there's Father McGivney in the middle of it, directing all the dancers and everything. And he was willing to do that, and he set up a lot of baseball games, and some of this activity was looked at just not, I don't want to be over dramatic, but a little askance by some of the older priests, where in some places, I think around the world, we can say for certain, the local bishop would have said, Father McGivney, you know, you can't play baseball. It's no way. The Bishop McMahon in Hartford was pleased that Father McGivney was getting through to his parishioners and keeping the young people especially so amused. And plus, Father McGivney was a very amusing man, so I'm sure that he too thought, I can't contain my love of life. I've got to enjoy seeing other people enjoy life. I'm pretty sure that's how he would look at it, that his enjoyment was seeing other people enjoying themselves.
Enjoying themselves, but also truly knowing themselves, and better yet, knowing God and God's love and God's incredible mercy. Father McGivney would strive to share that love and mercy with everyone, but especially those who could really use a little extra support. And one powerful example of that came in the unexpected relationship he formed with a man not long for this world.
Something that Father McGivney had so powerfully that would appeal to anyone today, whether Catholic, non-religious, whatever, would be his compassion. Almost everything that he did in his priestly ministry flowed from a heart of compassion. And whether it was compassion for these families that we've been speaking about, or whether compassion, for example, the famous case of Chip Smith, who was a Catholic man who, in a fit of drunkenness, killed a police officer, was tried and sentenced to death. And while he was in prison awaiting his execution, Father McGivney had heard about the case, of course, and visited him in prison.
We went back every day until the execution. And in the end, as you know, they allowed him to say Mass in the jail, and his mother was there. And his mother was, of course, crying. This is going to be the last time she's going to see her son. And he said to her, Mama, don't cry, I'm going home. That whole story really touched me. Devotion, sensitivity, acceptance, forgiveness. It's a beautiful story.
He spoke with him, he consoled him. He spoke to him about repentance, too. It wasn't only just, tap you on the back and make you feel good, but he spoke the truth to him. And through these whole series of visits, brought this man to a profound conversion, a profound regret for what he had done, and was able to give him the sacrament of confession so that his sins could be forgiven, but to continue to work with him, to speak with him, to build him up, to console him, all the way up to the day of his execution, where Father McGivney was present with him at the very moment he was killed.
The need to bolster faith, confronting Catholic prejudice, suffering serious poverty, helping aimless young men. Father McGivney saw many problems facing society and the Catholic people that he had been asked to shepherd. But one of the biggest was addressing the needs of real, struggling families. This young priest realized that a new creative solution would be needed. So a new creative solution is precisely what he supplied.
Father McGivney saw this huge problem in New Haven where if the men died early and the wives were left as widows and there were children, that the laws at the time were such that if a widow could not prove to the state that she had sufficient financial means to support the children and herself, the children were forcibly taken from her and put into orphanages and other institutional environments. So this was a twofold tragedy. One, you were breaking up families, so a family that already had a tragedy of losing their dad, losing their husband, now is being broken up even more. And secondly, since these institutions where they were placed were not Catholic, these children of Catholic families were no longer being raised in the Catholic faith, and there was no real provision to do so. And so you now had the loss of faith in the children. So again, Father McGivney's looking at this situation and seeing it as something that has to be addressed. And his approach was to gather the men of the parish together, and later on, of course, beyond the parish as well, but gather Catholic men together and get them to bond together and to pledge that if one of them was to pass away, was to die, that the others would work to support the widow, to assist the widow so that she would not be subject to what the state would otherwise do. And that desire to support the widows and the children was really the foundation and the inspiration of the Knights of Columbus.
Today, people have their troubles, but back then life was really, really, really tough. You talk about a safety net, social safety net. There was none back then, and that's part of the reason why he founded the Knights, to be able to provide for widows and orphans through the insurance.
Well, first of all, he was very empathetic. I mean, his natural tendency was to look to the downtrodden, those who were not in good circumstances. But remember, if you go back to the circumstances in which he was living, people were not surrounded by the supports that we have in modern generations and modern times. Namely, the government didn't have all the programs for those who were in difficult circumstances, and society itself didn't have the supports that are necessary. And he then had that natural instinct of wanting to help out people, and so that gave him this chance to work out his organizational abilities by founding the Knights of Columbus specifically to help those who were in trouble, those who were the widows, for instance, because their husbands would die at an early age of hard work and difficult circumstances in laboring conditions.
It took a bit of time, and Father McGivney, when he first set out to address this need, he didn't immediately say, I'm going to start a new organization. He explored what other organizations there were in other churches in other states. He even did some traveling to New York and other places to see in person what some of these other groups did. And while he saw elements he liked in some of them, he didn't ultimately come to the conclusion that any of those previously existing organizations did exactly what he thought needed to be done here. And so it was only after realizing that he realized, we have to start something new. And that's what he did.
What he did was found the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic fraternal benefit society. It was an organization based on the principles of charity, unity, and fraternity, but maybe even more fundamentally, it was based on the Catholic duty to help those in need. Having met in the basement of St. Mary's Church on February 2nd, 1882, to decide that they should form a new society and name it the Knights of Columbus, the group was officially granted its charter only a few weeks later on March 29th. Yes, it was an organization begun by a priest, and yes, that priest had asked permission of the bishop to even consider founding such a group, but the intention from the start was for the Knights of Columbus to inspire and galvanize the men who were part of it. Even from the very beginning, Father McGivney insisted that a layman should lead this lay organization, a principle that has remained true ever since. Father McGivney worked hard to support and develop this new organization, but he did so in a way that always gave members the lead in everything that was done.
He really, really believed in the people around him. I think he loved to see them thrive more than seeing himself thrive. How many times a day do I think that? No, I want to thrive. Let me be the one that thrives. So I think he seemed to always want to shove everybody else in the spotlight. But also I think it shows his vision was a little bit superhuman in a way. His vision wasn't just, let's see how big we can make this organization. I think he saw it outliving him and going beyond him. And that's hard to do. I don't know. I've written a lot of business history. You don't find any business leaders who think that way. You don't find too many people who think in terms of, if this is going to succeed, it has to be able to succeed without me. It has to be able to get big without me. And that's putting your ego aside.
Father McGivney tapped into something that I think is present in men, and that's a desire to lead and a desire to really do something that is needed. I think it's a characteristic that if you can present a real need to men and say, I need you, we need help here, can you help us, that it pulls the best out of men. And that's not something the church back in that day as a whole necessarily did well. It was, I might say, more clerically focused than our Catholic Church today. And in many places, Father did everything, or almost everything. So McGivney's vision, which was way ahead of its time, was to create this organization not being led by priests, not consisting of priests, but an organization of laymen where they were the leaders, they took the responsibility, they made the decisions, and they worked together to address real needs. And the men responded to that challenge that Father McGivney, it may have been his idea, but he took the idea and he presented it to these men, and they grasped it and they ran with it.
I think it was very unique about Father McGivney. He was ahead of his time in a certain sense by encouraging the laity, compelling them, showing his desire to serve, and that desire to serve, when it catches fire in the laity, that builds the whole church.
Walking the streets of New Haven in 1882, Father McGivney saw an incredible need to assist families who were struggling, to support Catholic men, to provide an outlet for people to actively live their faith. He was a priest who recognized the needs of his people, and so he decided to do something about it. The result was the Knights of Columbus, an impressive organization and one that could easily have become his only focus. But for Father McGivney, that wasn't the goal. That wasn't why he was ordained. So in November of 1884, when he received a letter from the bishop saying that he was being transferred to the town of Thomaston, he didn't fight the move or quickly devise some way to retain a tight control over the Knights from afar. No, he obediently let go. He would never forget the relationships that he'd built at his parish in New Haven, and he would always stay connected to the Knights of Columbus. He was their founder, after all, and retained his role as supreme chaplain until the day he died. But it was now time for Father McGivney to become a pastor, to share his priestly gifts with a new community in a very new place.
Yeah, it was probably a little, horse town from Waterbury, up north of Waterbury. He had very sophisticated people down in New Haven when he started the Knights of Columbus. He was, some very highly educated individuals near Yale campus. And then to be brought up to a little manufacturing town up here in Thomaston probably gave him a little bit of happiness, a little bit of a joy, because he's a little bit closer to home. They had the railroad tracks that were obviously there still, and he could travel easier to get back and forth to see his family. But it had to be an adjustment, going from a big city, two big cities, and then up to here to a little town of Thomaston.